that, I'm going to take a last time check here. It's 8:04. We still do have attendees signing on, but let me again introduce myself. My name is Jill Carrero. I'm the Business Development Director for our Handheld group in the pharmaceutical industries for Rigaku. So what that means is we make lots of instruments here at Rigaku, specifically a group based in Wilmington, Massachusetts makes handheld instruments, and I am in charge of helping to grow our relationships with customers like you in our pharmaceutical industry. So thank you very much for attending. I also want to make an introduction to Irving Mondragon, who is my partner, local in Brazil. Many of you probably know him and his company, Mondragon Equipamentos. We have worked together for a number of years, Irving and I, since before we had children, and now our children are home with us, as you all probably have maybe children home with you in this sincerely, special and challenging time in all of our lives. I am grateful to have partnership of people like Irving, and I want to introduce him here and allow him to say hello to all of you. Irving?
Boa noite a todos. Primeiro, muito obrigada por estarem aqui, né, para participar desse webinar. A intenção desse webinar é fazer uma introdução, né, comentada desde a espectrometria Raman, desde a teoria, até apresentar o novo equipamento da Rigaku, né, que nós estamos representando eles agora no Brasil, e entrar em detalhes na parte de teoria, entrar em detalhes na parte de equipamentos, de compliance, de integridade de dados. Então, assim, é um workshop que vai ter muita informação, é um workshop bem rico em informação, eu espero que vocês aproveitem. Se vocês tiverem alguma dúvida, fiquem à vontade, mandem mensagem pelo chat, pelo QIA, e aí eu vou respondendo as mensagens de vocês também. Aos que quiserem depois receber cópia desta apresentação, nós estaremos enviando também cópia desta apresentação para os interessados, ok? Então eu estou à disposição, estou aqui escutando, qualquer dúvida, fiquem à vontade e perguntem.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Irving. So let us begin. This presentation is intended to be, as we say here in America, nuts to bolts. So I'm going to start with kind of an explanation of what Raman is for you. A little background for those of you who may just have signed on and missed my quick introduction. Rigaku is an older company. We were founded in 1951. We're headquartered in Tokyo, Japan, but myself, I'm from our facility in Wilmington, Massachusetts, which is where our handheld group is located. We are called Rigaku Analytical Devices. Maybe you're familiar with our XRF or XRD, X-ray diffraction or fluorescence, benchtop types of instruments. Those are made in Texas. Well, I'm from Massachusetts, and that's where we make handheld Raman devices as well as handheld LIBS devices. We are a team of over 45 people. We focus purely on handhelds at that facility, and a number of us have worked together for many, many, many years. In fact, Irving and I shared partnership about 10 years ago with the first handheld instrument that was introduced into the pharmaceutical industry. And many of the team members that I am proud to work with there in Wilmington also came from that history and that background and that team. So we're very proud to work together to solve your problems. But really, it's all about frequencies and vibrations. And to understand Raman spectroscopy, that's where we have to start. Molecules are made up of atoms, and those atoms, of course, are held together by chemical bonds. And those bonds aren't rigid, right? They vibrate. They vibrate, they stretch, And depending on which atoms are connected and the types of bonds that connect those atoms and what's around those atoms and those bonds that are around them, they'll vibrate at different frequencies. And depending on how they vibrate, we can use different vibrational spectroscopy methods. And here I show you a brief explanation of Raman mid-infrared, which is mostly what we call FTIR, or Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, and then near infrared. We use these three techniques in vibrational spectroscopy to characterize materials. And they differ kind of in two ways. So when you're looking at FTIR and near infrared, you basically look at white light. You put white light on a sample and you're measuring what passes through the sample. You can also kind of consider it what's absorbed by the sample as a conference, but it's all about what transfers through the sample. And then you have a characteristic set of wavelengths to measure. With Raman, you use a single wavelength, a laser, versus the white light that you use with FTIR and near infrared. And what happens is that you get a shift from that wavelength of light, and you measure the shift in that light. So how does it look when you look a little bit closer? On the left here, you see a very, very simple schematic of what's happening inside of a progeny. So this is a progeny, and you can imagine that's the laser pointing down. And when the laser light comes out, it hits the sample, and some comes off, and we detect it. And what we get is a spectrum. And we get two spectrums for two different types of materials, and we can use an onboard algorithm on the instrument to tell the difference between those materials. It's like a fingerprint. And that's what makes Raman so great for this type of analysis. When we look even closer, though, it's really a special thing that's happening here. You know, when we point white light or any type of light at a surface, only 1 out of 1,000,000 photons of light does what's called Raman scattering. All of the rest of the light just rallies back out. It essentially bounces right back off with the exact same wavelength of light. But 1 in 1,000,000 photons does something very interesting, and that was observed by C.V. Raman back in 1928. And essentially, that's why it's called Raman scattering, and that's a Stokes shift. And so what happens is this. If we look at the middle two lines here, I'm going to use my cursor to highlight these. And please, again, if you have any questions, ask them through the Q&A, and myself or Irving will try to acknowledge those either during the presentation or at the end. But when you're looking at this diagram here, Rayleigh scattering is that elastic scattering. So essentially, if you're looking at a 1064 nanometer excitation, you'll get to that excited state, and then you'll fall right back down to the same level. With Raman scattering, that very unique occurrence that happens, you have the energy state fall differently. And so you can measure that if you're very careful to pay attention. Now, this was noticed in 1928. It's 2020. Handheld Ramans have been in use for a good 10, 15 years now in different industries, from the safety and security industry and then into the pharmaceutical industry about 10 years ago. So why did it take so long? Well, that's because of that rareness of the occurrence. You know, 1 in 1,000,000 photons, it took a lot of energy, a lot of laser power, and a really, really awesome detector, a big one, because we hadn't figured out how to turn computers into little tiny phones. So Raman instruments were available, but they were the size of conference tables. Huge, huge tools that took a lot of work and a lot of manipulation to understand how to use them. Well, with the advent of miniaturization, handheld Raman is now available in lots of industries. When we're looking at specifically what's happening with Raman spectroscopy, this is a diagram of the progeny. And this is what happens. So, forgive me, that's a very grayed out. I apologize. I don't know why that's grayed out there. So when we're talking about what's happening inside the box, again, I'm going to show you right here. This is the box, okay? When we're using the box, we have a touch screen here. The laser comes out here. And all of the thinking goes on in here. So with Progeny, 1064 nanometer laser comes out of the instrument. And it hits the sample. It goes through the transparent container into the sample. And it excites the molecule of the sample. Some light is scattered away, and that's the Rayleigh portion. But some light is shifted. And that shifted light is that blue line going down. And that's collected. It's detected by our in-gasket detector. And then basically measure the shift, right? We measure that Raman scatter. And we have a spectrum that represents the sample that we just measured. And inside of the instrument, there's a computer. And on that computer is a library of reference spectra. And the instrument does a comparison with a proprietary algorithm of the reference spectra and the sample spectra to make sure that they match up. And when they do, you verified your material. Why do we use Raman then? I mean, we have FTIR and we had near infrared. And those were the standards. And they still are in lots of places in the world, right? Lots and lots of people still depend on FTIR or near infrared for their incoming raw materials inspection. But in a lot of places, people have actually figured out that Raman is much more suitable. And why is that? It's because it kind of takes the best of both worlds, right? This is not a new thing for people to figure out maybe on the line here, but perhaps for some of you it is. Why is Raman so good? Well, because it's very specific. And that is more key than any other advantage when it comes to Raman. Is if you look at that bottom right there, you see these spectra. Those spectra have nice, sharp, tight peaks. Just like FTIR, Raman has nice, sharp, tight peaks. So it's very easy for an instrument to tell the difference between two very closely related materials. Those sharp peaks are very representative of the molecule structure inside of that material. Now, the advantage of near infrared and why it's been used so much over the years for raw material identification, even though the spectra look nothing like that. If any of you are familiar with near infrared spectra, they often look like kind of a wavy bump. Nothing like these sharp, almost HPLC-like spectra, right? With near infrared, however, you don't have to have direct contact with the sample like you do with FTIR. And so that's why near infrared was used specifically in the pharmaceutical industry, because it was great, right? You didn't have to have contact with the sample. Well, as soon as Raman was miniaturized and allowed the advantages of both non-contact analysis that near infrared did, but then also that highly specific analysis that FTIR allowed, it was a no-brainer, right? Companies started to identify that this was a great technology, and then very quickly it was acknowledged by the NVMAs and the NVISAs and USP and FDA, and now it's written into every monograph across the planet, right? So we are all familiar with Raman. But how much do we know about Raman? This is a little bit of a deep dive, and I hope that you appreciate it, because for me, I like to know what's going on behind the scenes. And so this is a little bit of a deep dive for all of us here. Raman and IR spectroscopy, they are both all about looking at the molecule, but they're different in certain ways. Specifically, when you're looking at infrared and near infrared, they are all about it's the dipole vibrations, working through light absorption or transmission again. But it's all about those side chains and the polar bonds, and it focuses on the functional groups, and specifically how the overtones of combination bands work together. Whereas Raman is definitely all about the skeletal conformation. It provides a very, very specific molecular fingerprint of more symmetric bonds, homonuclear bonds, anything that's a CC, aromatics. Raman loves those type of molecules. But both molecules both methods are considered quite complementary. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, something called the mutual exclusion principle. And here we are. Now, this is another bit of information to really understand, and it was key in the early stages. And Irving, you could probably remember back in those days when we were trying to get people to understand that Raman was okay. Near infrared had been used for so many years, but Raman was okay too. But this was a key part of it, and it's still key to understanding the place for Raman in the world of science, because it's true, and it's physics of it all, right? In a symmetric molecule, here's the unique thing: vibrations that are Raman active are usually not infrared active, and the vice versa is true. So if you take dioxide or carbon dioxide, you know, one will work very well with Raman, and then it won't work very well with infrared. So that's one example of the mutual exclusion principle. When you're talking about different kinds of types of symmetry, you'll always see that bands that are active with infrared won't be active with Raman, or they will be active with both, or they won't be active with either. So that's something, you know, interesting. As scientists, you know, these type of analysis can tell us so much. We can really draw a lot of information by using these techniques to learn about our molecules and our science. So I really love these vibrational spectroscopy methods. You know, I've worked with HPLC, I've worked with all sorts of science, but I really, really enjoy what we can learn from Raman specifically. And then for a complex molecule that has absolutely no symmetry, they're either going to be, you know, they're usually going to be active in both. So when we're looking at the bottom, it's something to be very considerate of, that strong bands in the IR spectrum are usually going to be weak when it comes to Raman, and vice versa. And that is because of how bands stretch and how the molecule is active, and what is seen in stretching versus bending in one technology versus the other. And let me switch to the next slide to give you a little bit of understanding on this. When we're looking at common functional group frequencies, you know, you can kind of think about it that each peak corresponds to a functional group on your Raman spectrum. So it's awesome because you can look at that Raman spectrum and deduce what your molecule looks like. And when you're looking at, you know, a chart like this, well, my goodness, you know, looking at the fingerprint region on the side, if we zoom in a little bit more, we can really, really learn about the bonds that are present in our molecule. And so, you know, while handheld Raman is most certainly, it's a tool for raw material ID, you know, if you use your Raman and you put your Raman in the hands of your development groups, I've seen it myself, the amount of information that can be learned from Raman Spectra when everybody has access to a tool that's so easy to use. It's really quite validating, because it's not just a raw materials identification tool. When you're looking, you know, at the spectral range over Raman science, it mostly falls between 500 and 1800 wave numbers. And again, the important thing to remember, I love this chart. Everyone, you'll have a copy of this presentation. So, you know, any of the little bits that you see in here that you may think you find useful in the future, they are yours. But I think what's important to take away from this is that, you know, molecules are made of bonds, and from this Raman spectra, you can really determine what those bonds and atoms are. But okay, that gives me great understanding of how to use the information that I get from my handheld Raman, right? But how do I know if I can even use my Raman for the materials that I have? That's a really good question. Well, the first thing that we do when we're working with anyone is to help to understand that very, very specifically about your materials. So if you were to send me or Irving a list of the materials that you have on site, we would be very happy to go through them and say, this one works, this one does not work, this one works, maybe. That's something that we do. But to kind of understand it, if something's covalent, it's very likely to be Raman active. And if something's ionic, it's likely to not be active, or to be friendly with Raman. And that's the basic breakdown. And then you have the added caveat of, is if it's aqueous, if it dissolves in water, it's probably not going to be a good Raman candidate. So I like to always tell people, if you look at the molecule and it's got 2 nonmetals in it, if it's got carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, or any combination of those, it's probably going to work with Raman. Most materials in the pharmaceutical industry are friendly with Raman, and that's again why it's so commonly used. So to summarize, what makes Raman great for raw material ID? It's non-contact, right? You can test through transparent containers. It's very fast. It's built for purpose. So when I say built for purpose, I mean, it does what it's supposed to do, and it does it easily, right? So this tool is in my hand, and it's built exactly the way that I always wanted my handheld Raman to work. It's weighted the right way, it's touchscreen, and it gives me the data that I want on board, but also puts it where I want it to be securely. It's a very robust solution too. It can be completely decontaminated, which in the time that we are in now, it's more important than ever that a tool like this can be completely washed down. It's anodized aluminum. It's got no rubberized boot or anything like that to cause risks. So I really appreciate that about the tool. It's certainly industry accepted. It's in all of the international pharmacopoeia, and I certainly can point you to more information if you need any support on that side. We're going to talk more about how specifically Progeny works. In the world of handheld Raman, I keep mentioning that it's used for raw material identification, and for the majority of applications for handheld Raman, active ingredients, APIs, excipients, natural materials used in nutraceutical products, fillers, and then packaging. These are all really awesome applications for handheld Raman. It's a bulk analysis for the most part, so it's always important to keep that in mind. Verification with a 1064 based tool is a really, really awesome application to consider if you're using handheld Raman already, or if you're just considering kind of what you can do with it. The number of companies that we work with that are doing in-package blister pack verification of their samples, or doing added levels of verification when working with contract suppliers. It's really an awesome way to kind of make the most of the tool. Cell culture medias and things like that, different applications. If you're interested in learning any more about that, in about 2 weeks' time, we have a really interesting webinar. It's on a Thursday morning in 2 weeks' time. I think May 5th would be the date then. And that it's going to focus all about specific, interesting applications of Raman, from cell culture medias, flowers, different kinds of things. So forgive me, please join us for that. And then authentication. So finished products, anti-counterfeit, that's a great application for handheld Raman. And it's really where it got the start into the pharmaceutical industry. The first handheld Ramans were used to tell the difference between clandestine white powder and something that was innocuous. So bad for you drug white powder and maybe flour sample. Those were the first handheld Ramans, and then they came into the pharmaceutical industry. So Raman is great. I've been talking a lot about that for a while, but it's not the solution for everything. So what are the limits of handheld Raman? Specifically with Progeny, the instrument allows for measurement through translucent and transparent packaging. So you must be able, as a general rule, to see your product if you want to measure it with Progeny. No black materials and no black containers, because the laser light will be absorbed, and no metal particles. So sometimes folks want to look for contamination, small fine metal particles. It's not a great application for Raman. And specifically to moisture, you know, there are some applications where moisture can affect particle size. And there are historical scientific papers that you'll find that reference Raman being used to measure particle size. But as a standard, handheld Raman is great because it doesn't see moisture. So it's insensitive to moisture content, so you can build very robust methods very easy. But you can't measure moisture. So how does it work? How do we change the workflow with a handheld Raman device? I would, you know, love to know how many of you out there are using a handheld Raman, and how maybe it's changed your workflow. Specifically, if you look at the left side, that's the traditional raw material workflow. And then if you look at the right side, that's the handheld workflow. And it's all about sampling, right? It's all about preventing the need to open and sample 100 containers of product. When maybe a compendial test only requires that 11 of those 100 containers go through full testing, and then we have to do ID testing on the rest of the containers. Well, handheld Raman would allow you to do, you know, through package testing across the liner, rather than putting all of those barrels into a quarantine area and slowing down your turnaround and your manufacturing process. Well, handheld Raman allows you, again, to just speed up the workflow. It also allows you to do that work without contaminating anyone, right? Without opening containers or moving to a sampling suite or doing that work. It's just a much faster and easier process with a handheld Raman. It's the job that we have to do, right? It's required. Regulations absolutely drive us to do the work so that we can make our product. However, you know, Raman allows us to do it much, much faster, essentially much cheaper. So this is the Progeny 1064 handheld Raman. Again, that's this. What does the workflow, I showed you kind of an overview of what the workflow looks like, big picture. What does the workflow look like on the instrument? So this is a touch screen. It's amazing. We've also got buttons here, but this is a touch screen on the instrument, and this is what's shown on the touch screen. So workflow on the Progeny is very, very easy. It's all about swiping, touching. It feels like this. Maybe it doesn't look as much like this. Oh, there's my beautiful children. Maybe it doesn't look as much like this, but it feels like that. It works like that. And that's what matters. So when we're looking at the screens, we see a progression. And for the most part, this is exactly the 10 steps that a user is going to go through when they're doing verification of a material. So you've received the material. We look at the label. We say, okay, we have received gelatin. We turn on the Progeny. We sign into the Progeny, of course, right? Everything is password protected and user controlled. So, of course, that user is going to sign in with their password. They're going to hit scan. And then from there, they're going to have the option to pick application or a batch, or they're going to go into analyze mode. Analyze mode is just kind of a blind analysis. What is this material? But in the world of raw material identification, that's not how we should be doing our work. We need gelatin. So in this case, we might go to application, and maybe you have an application list here that includes my company, raw materials. And then you'd click on the raw material that you've chosen, or that you've received, I should say. In this case, it's also possible to use a barcode. We have an integrated barcode scanner, so that if you have a barcode that represents your specific material name associated in your systems, then that can be just scanned and it will take you automatically to this 5th screen here. At that point, it's simple. It's always 2 clicks to get to the scan. And then at that point, what will happen is that the laser will come on, and depending on the algorithm or the application settings that you have designed, or your developer has designed, I should say, the progeny will go through a process of exciting the sample with a laser and then collecting the Raman information from the sample. And then it will compare it to the reference spectra that has been stored inside of the instrument and provide you with a pass or fail on the screen. Why would you pick 1064? Well, it's less fluorescence. If you've used a handheld Raman before and it wasn't 1064 nanometer based, something happens. If it's 785 nanometer based, something happens called fluorescence. You may see a lot of it in some materials. You may not see a lot of it in some materials. The likelihood of you using the instrument on materials that you see a lot of fluorescence is very small, because it makes it very, very difficult to analyze these materials. It slows down the analysis to a degree that it may prevent the analysis of that material completely, or it might turn a scan time that on a 1064 nanometer base instrument is only maybe 5 seconds into a scan time that could be minutes. And so fluorescence is a big deal. Now, there's a whole subset of materials that it's a huge deal for. And when we're talking about what those materials are, this chart kind of highlights some of those. So when you're talking about anything that's natural, that's first and foremost. Any natural material or anything that's got a slightly yellow tinge, those materials tend to fluoresce a lot. Also, anything like MCC, gelatin, polysorbates, all of those materials tend to fluoresce a lot. So the advantage of using a 1064 nanometer based instrument is that you just don't see that fluorescence. You can see all of the materials that a 785 nanometer instrument can, but a whole subset that it can't. And you just test all of those 785 nanometer materials just much, much, much faster. That was by far the first thing that really stood out to me when I first started working with Progeny, is how fast it was. And if you go to our YouTube channel, you can see a number of videos that really highlight that. I mean, you can see the scan time. Some materials on the 785 nanometer base instrument that maybe you're using, 10 minutes are only seconds on a Progeny. So it's really a drastic difference. And this is a non-exclusive list of some of the materials that you will see that difference for. And it is an absolute reality that some of these materials are the highest volume materials that you will see at your site. Microcrystalline cellulose tends to be one of the most high volume excipients that we see, right? Methocell, absolutely used quite often. So when you're talking about, when you're talking about using, handheld Raman, if you want the greatest breadth of reach for your material list, well, 1064 is certainly going to do that. Here are a few examples so that you can see firsthand what kind of the implications of what fluorescence looks like. Here's the thing. Specifically, I can say, I know that in some cases, folks use 785 nanometer based Raman to test microcrystalline cellulose based on those two little peaks on the bottom left hand. Now, that is a spectrum, but when we're talking about quality of spectrum and the ability of an instrument to tell the difference between large variants of materials, multiple vendors, and then huge material lists, well, the data on the right that has much more specific information about the molecular bonds that are present in microcrystalline cellulose, that gives me much more confidence when I'm building my library and when I'm going through my validation process. Here are a couple of natural examples. Well, I shouldn't say a couple, but acacia gum is a natural example shown on the top there. And then methylcellulose, another couple of examples where you'll see a lot of fluorescence on the left with 785 nanometer instruments, but it almost disappears with a 1064 based progeny. What does it mean? It just means speed. I did touch on this a little bit before, but when you're talking about APIs, that's not where you see the huge difference, right? A 785 nanometer instrument is going to be almost instant for API. So is a 1064 nanometer base instrument. But when you're talking about some of these other materials and anything that's got a yellow tinge to it, it makes a drastic difference in your scan time, up to 90% decrease. So when you're talking about doing not just one scan, but you've got 20 or 40 or maybe 100 scans to do because you've received 30 barrels, but you want to test at the top, middle, and bottom of each barrel, well, that really adds up when the scan time goes from being 15 seconds to 3 minutes. It also really makes a difference when it comes to the library, and I touched on this just a second ago. Progeny spectra are really full of information. There's less information, there's less fluorescence, so more information can be derived from the spectra, and this is something that stood out in the feedback when, again, I first started working with Progeny, and I went to the folks that I knew had once used 785 nanometer base instruments, and now we're using 1064 base Progeny. And by far, the biggest piece of feedback that they gave me, besides, wow, it's really fast, is that there was just so much more to learn about their samples, and especially the more complex samples that there were. So if it was a finished product, people were saying they were getting blown away by the amount of information that Progeny was telling them about their samples versus a 785 instrument. So that is something that stands out to me because it also is very, very important when you're talking about building a library. The instrument works by comparing your sample spectra to a library that you've taught is your validated library on your instrument. The more information you have in your spectra, the more robust and easier that validation process is. Going back to like near infrared, if any of you have ever built and validated a library on a benchtop near infrared instrument, it is not a pretty process because there's very little specificity. It's hard to tell the difference between materials. Well, if it's easier to tell the difference between materials because you have more spectral information, well, it goes further to that validation process and simplifying it. And it makes performing your robustness and your selectivity analysis just much more straightforward because you have less fluorescence to get in the way of being able to tell two materials from each other. So if you ever want to learn about that and how that gets done, you just let me know and we'll talk about that in more detail. I did just kind of touch on some of this. I forgot that this was the next slide. I got a little bit ahead of myself, but it's like, again, important to note just as an understanding that the way that libraries work is that the Progeny comes with a library of over 12,000 onboard material spectra. Now, those material spectra are really great spectra. Unfortunately, they are not traceable spectra. So if you want to use your library or your Progeny in a compliant fashion for raw materials release in a manufacturing process, you have to build a validated library. Now, it's very, very easy to do it with Raman and specifically with Progeny because of the way we built Progeny, because of the way it thinks internally. How it usually works is this. You're going to find one very well characterized retained sample, or you're going to purchase a USP sample of your material. And that's easier to do than you ever would imagine. You probably have a cabinet of retains. And not only would you want to have one retain to build your reference from, but you're going to have a number of retains to act as some of your preliminary validation. And then you also want to have some cross-lot samples to act as your validation samples. And then you're going to design that library structure and your validation process so that, when you're using your Progeny, you have a really nice, robust system so that when you have incoming materials and you're low-level operator does your analysis, the pass-fails that they get on the screen are really trustworthy, and you can go forward doing that analysis in the hands of a low-level operator versus tying up a lab operator or a lab scientist with this type of analysis. So when we're talking about Progeny, it's a little different from some other tools available out there. One big difference is that it's angled. Do you see that? It's angled. And that makes a lot of sense when you're doing like this. It makes it really wonderful when you're doing analysis in downward facing drums and things like this. It's got a touch screen, and that by far is one of the greatest advantages of using Progeny. So it allows you to just touch on the screen, zoom in, swipe to kind of learn more about what's happening on your spectra. It's got a barcode scanner and also an integrated camera there. The adjustable focus nose cone, and we can learn a little bit more about this, but this is a great tool because what it does is allow you to really optimize the level of energy for different container types, really just simply by twisting and changing the level of distance of penetration into sample containers. And again, it's a sealed system, so I could give this a good whack. It's no moving parts inside there, but it's also completely washable. I could dip this in alcohol if I wanted to. One of the most key features of using Progeny, besides the fact that it's also Wi-Fi capable, so this right now is connected to my home network. I can wirelessly transfer data from this instrument onto my PC securely, is that it has a camera. Okay, so as I mentioned before, that little spot there is an integrated camera and barcode scanner. So what this allows you to do is to pull up your analysis methods using barcode. And the left side of our screen here kind of shows how that would work. And it really is a time saver and allows you quite a level of compliance in terms of the ability of the instrument to be integrated into your processes with very, very little input or user selection. This is a process that can be highly integrated to use barcodes and drive through the process. It also allows you to take pictures. So I can't tell you the number of times that customers have described to me how they use this camera, both to take pictures of their samples, specifically when we're talking about the very complex world that we're in right now in terms of pharmaceutical industry and how many companies kind of make product for each other. The process of doing package testing and the process of sending product from point A to point B to do part of the process and point B to point C to do the other part of the process. Well, at each receipt, there is responsibility. And part of the responsibility is, of course, to do material analysis, but visual inspection is a big part of that too. And any compromised situations can be captured just like that by taking a picture. If you see here on the bottom right, it allows you very easily to take a picture of the sample by touching a point on the button, and that sample is captured and stored with the data report permanently, and it can be reported, and shared where it needs to be. So if you receive a container that's got an open liner inside and it's full of white powder, well, instead of that being just a note that's made, there's a photograph that clearly demonstrates how unacceptable that is to your vendor. And that's very, very powerful information. So the data, right? So what data is available to me? I get it. I scan my materials, right? What data do I get to see? Access to Progeny, first of all, the data is only available to whomever you want to have the data. Everything is user level controlled and password protected on the instrument, but also on our Rigaku Sync 3 software control. So the package that allows you to sync your data from the Progeny onto your secure server location, that's also password controlled. The great thing about Progeny, it provides on-screen pass-fail results in accordance to the applications that your team has set up, right? So again, it's going to take a spectrum of your sample and it's going to compare it to a reference spectrum that you've stored in the instrument. And it's going to provide what is called a correlation coefficient. And that correlation coefficient comes from an algorithm. And I'm not going to tell you the details of that algorithm. But that correlation coefficient, it's settable. The pass-fail threshold is settable by you. And it doesn't have to be the same everywhere. So for the vast majority of raw materials identification applications, that threshold is set at 0.95. But in some cases, we see folks that have maybe a specific set of polymorphs on site. And with their 0.95 pass-fail threshold, those polymorphs will pass for each other. Well, the unique thing about Progeny is that you can layer on what is another application, essentially, specific for that polymorph set, so that when those are received, they're compared maybe at a 0.98 or 0.97 threshold. And so they're more closely compared. And so you can tell the difference between those materials without passing them for each other. That's a really unique feature of Progeny, that ability to have control over the way it thinks and the way it makes its decisions. The tool then at that point, once it gives you your pass-fail information and gives you that correlation coefficient, well then right there at the tool, you're moving through a batch of information. You're not going to be focused on that correlation coefficient and the spectra and all of that. You're going to be focused on the next container. And then when you move through the containers, then you're going to be focused on electronically signing off on that batch, which happens right here on the tool. But you also have the ability to just do so much more with the data on the tool. And that's a unique thing about Progeny too. You can view the scans right on the screens. You can stack the spectra. You can overlay spectra. Say you ran a scan today and it reminds you of a scan that you ran 3 weeks ago. Well, you can go and pull that scan up on the Progeny itself and overlay it to what you just did to see if there's a tiny peak difference or something like this. And you can also zoom in, and that's such a feature that we take it for granted now. Again, when we're talking about our telephones, right? We do this all the time. My 4-year-old does that all the time. It's inherent to us now. Well, Progeny is very much an intuitive tool that way. There's a lot that, it doesn't look as cool, but it just thinks so much smarter. The data files that are available once you scan over your data or you sync over your data, because right, we do all of this great work, we get our electronic sign-offs, and then at the end of the shift, we sync the data. We want that data to be in a secure server location. Well, the data that is synced comes in a multitude of formats. The raw, data is obviously there. So, beautiful CSV, TXT files, XML, SPC, as well as PDF reports. Batch reporting functionalities within Progeny are really unique in that it allows you to add and subtract different fields when you're doing your batches. If you have one batch mixed in with maybe another batch, say you've got 50 containers, and of the 50 containers, half are from one vendor and half are from the other. And as you're moving through your analysis, your ID of all these materials, you want to actually mark on your report which vendor sent these ones and which vendor sent these ones. That's a field that can be added into Progeny and can be automatically filled in as the user is going through their process. So little customization features like that for your workflow make Progeny a really compliant solution, because it's supposed to be the way you want it to be. It's supposed to ask you the things that you want to enter. I'm not using the right language for this, forgive me. Progeny gives you the ability to basically set up your workflow along the lines of the way that you want to do your workflow. So if you want your user to always enter a vendor, or you want your user to use barcodes and things like that, you have such a grand capacity for that. And taking the photos of damaged receipt packaging and things like that, that's just another example of that. Software-wise, I certainly mentioned my adoration for the swipe ability on the screen, but really it's also the versatility in how Progeny allows you full control of analysis parameters is something that I think historically, that's why you in Brazil don't know very much about Progeny. We haven't been very good about telling you about the things that it's great at. And this is one of the things that it's really great at, is that if you want to change the scan range to be limited, you can do that with a Progeny. If you want to change that correlation coefficient, as I mentioned, to make your pass-fail value a little bit different, you can do that with a Progeny. If you want your Progeny to scan at 290 milliwatts or 450 milliwatts, or you want it to auto select that power, it will do that. The exposure time, all of these are auto settable so that the instrument will do what it needs to do to determine the best settings, but it's also available to you to design your own experiments and to be able to understand that maybe for some materials, you want to test everything at certain parameters. When you're talking about data management, we have such an amazing solution for that as well. First and foremost, in that it's a Wi-Fi capable solution. So you can also connect via USB, plugged into the bottom of the instrument, here. And here's the battery, if you see here. So the battery power on a Progeny is about 6.5 hours running full time. But the sync solution with Progeny is a really streamlined solution in that it's going to offer you the capability to transfer all of your data off the instrument in a hands-off fashion, in such that if you want an operator to be able to use the instrument, sync the data, but then after the fact, never be able to access or change that data, that's allowable through Rigaku Sync 3. When we're looking at the different connection capacities of Progeny, it's just really easy to set it up. It's just as simple as turning on the Wi-Fi on the instrument itself, or connecting via USB to either a port on the wall or directly to a local computer. This allows you, when you're doing this work, to sync your data over, to then further review your data and further approve that data. There are two options for syncing over your data, and really I want to share that Rigaku Sync 3 is a very new option. We actually just released it this week. If you are a current customer of Progeny, please contact us, because we would love to provide that to you, of course. But I want to give you kind of a basic breakdown of the ways that it can work, because again, it's a very robust solution and versatile, though. You can do it however you want to do it. Some people prefer the older solution, and so that's number 2. And that's basically what we used to offer, and we still offer it to you if you'd like. It's a web page, it's late here, web page based portal that allows you essentially to look inside of the instrument, right? It allows you access to the instrument and allows you to manually pull the data off the instrument and put it in your secure server. We understand that people want a sync option, and we have recently redesigned our Rigaku Sync 3 software, and that, instead of acting as kind of a web portal, that's an actual little software package. It is installed on a local PC. That local PC must have access to your secure server. The end user will connect to that secure server path either via Wi-Fi or USB, and then initiate the transfer of files. And now that initiation of transfer of files, that could be done via your developer up in the laboratory or by the user there. So there's really a real breadth of options available to you. And regardless of which way you choose to move your data, Progeny is very unique in that we add that extra level of security in that there's a permanent resident copy of data that exists on the instrument that allows you to have that extra confidence about the longevity of your data. When you're looking at Rigaku Sync 3, and this is the software package that allows you to sync over your data into a secure location, but it also acts as a really great graphical interface. If you want to take a look at your software, the bottom right is an explanation of kind of an example of this. If you see, here's a list of all the scans, and then there's one example, red and blue overlay of the sample spectrum and reference spectrum showing, a very typical Raman spectrum, and that's creatine there, I see. There is the ability with Rigaku Sync 3, and this is a great feature, to create the syncing automatically. So what will happen is, as soon as your instrument is loaded up onto or is connected to your secure server location, and we have a sign-in to Rigaku Sync 3 here, that allows the syncing process to automatically start, and any new data will automatically be brought over into your secure server location. It also is selectable at that moment to have file reports automatically generated. So you can just sync over the data, but say every time you sync, you also want a PDF of the batch report. That is available now. You can, that blind auto sync feature that I mentioned, it's just a really terrific feature to allow your workflow harmonization and streamlining, and it prevents any operator level user from, again, having access to the results in the end. It also allows you to clear data. So I mentioned that the instrument allows a permanent resident copy of all data that has ever been generated with Progeny. Well, we did get some feedback from customers that, we don't need data that's 5 years old. We really like having data for 2 years on the instrument, but we don't want to have data that's 5 years old. So now we allow you this option to clear data maybe past 3 years or something like this. It's entirely up to your administrator and developer. When you're looking at the home screen of Progeny, you can look at the Spectra, you can look at the details of all of the audit trail, you can look at all of the graphs and overlays, but there are different features that really lend to different regulations in the pharmaceutical industry, specifically like ALCOA guidelines around completeness of data and the ability to look at what has been generated. I think those principles are very important, especially when you're considering working efficiently. It's not just about doing a job that is thorough, but it's doing a job that's efficient and thorough. And part of the ALCOA principles kind of outline that. And I think some of the features here in Sync 3 really allow you to do that. And one of the features that I love about that is this kind of highlight here in this red box. The home screen will display exactly what data has been generated. So I can't tell you how many times customers will want to understand, do I have a PDF of that? Have I generated what types of files for this data? This screen really, through these colored icons on the right here, really just allows you a quick snapshot understanding and a graphical user face that, or user interface that we're kind of accustomed to seeing nowadays. When you're talking about the setup logistics behind Rigaku Sync 3, there are so many, administrator selected options. Specific, we've talked about what type of data is generated, what kind of files, and when those files are generated. So again, it can happen when the sync occurs, or you can go back in and generate those files afterwards. Whether that data is archived permanently or cleared off after certain times. And then certain things like customizing report fields. So no longer does your report field have to say sample, it can have all the language in Portuguese if you'd prefer. And that's something I think that's, important for essentially, how the instrument gets used in a day-to-day process. The path for setting the server address is essentially through a UNC network path. And again, this allows you, in conjunction with essentially a little service that runs in the back, it's called Rigaku service. It allows you to use Rigaku Sync 3 in a way that would lock out any user that is not allowed write or read access to a certain folder through permissions granted in Rigaku service. They can sync up into that folder without ever being able to do any further processing or control on that folder. So this is a really unique and interesting capacity when we're talking about just how to use the data and how to get the data where we want it to. It's a very, very robust option. So it's all about reviewing that data too after the fact. If you want to take that data and look at it through Rigaku Sync 3, certainly we'll give you many licenses to load on different computers if you like, but you're also, able to take those native data files and view it on different programs. Maybe you have Omnic, maybe you have a benchtop near infrared that uses a different program. You can open up one of these SPC files very easily and look at that data there. So that's always an option for you. And if you want to, understand what's in the results, it's everything, right? It's everything to do with the scan name or the scan, including the application name and the file name, all the conditions of the scan, so how it was run, the timing and things like that. And then of course, all the important stuff, right? The spectra and the CC value and what was found in any background searching and things like that. Because if you don't find that it's a pass, Progeny will go and figure out, well, what is this material? That's something that will be included on the report, of course. And then PDFs will include your e-signatures, company logos, sample photographs, all of that information. A couple of very important questions. And I think I probably have made this pretty clear, but I wanted to, again, just make sure we highlight, can the end user make any changes to the data, right? We must generate Raman data. Hopefully we get lots of passes, right? We catch bad materials when they come in the door if they're a fail, but we want to always have a traceable record of that effort. And with Rigaku Sync 3, it allows you to do that. And absolutely no, the user cannot make any changes to the data after that data is synced over to your secure location. And is it automatic? Well, that's entirely up to you. It does, again, allow an auto sync feature, and it could really be as easy as putting Progeny into a docking station at the end of the night. That is such an awesome way that some of our customers end their workflow, is by plugging Progeny down into its docking station, putting it to sleep in a nice safe place, and the sync process starts with that. And then, the next morning, their QC supervisor can come in and can go into the secure server location and give approval to those records. So it's a really, really nice streamlined way to do the work. And if you ever wanted to have a demonstration of that, please reach out. I can link in with your network. I can do lots of different things virtually from 1,000 miles away. I'm happy to kind of help you understand that more firsthand if you're interested in that. So to kind of summarize, the complete package of Progeny. Most certainly, what I love most about it, it's very versatile, right? I said it acts as a handheld raw material identification tool, gives you more information about more materials, being a 1064 nanometer instrument, but the ability to change parameters, control your scanning analysis parameters, to be able to look at your data on the instrument, zoom in, compare things. Those are things that make me really love Progeny. When you're talking about why Progeny exists for the pharmaceutical realm, full IQ/OQ package, 24/7 customer support. So that is an extension through Irving and his group as well. So we are in Wilmington, Massachusetts, always available to you. and to our customers 24/7 by phone and by email. So that's a commitment that we hold true for all our customers, no matter where you are. And that means if you have a problem with the skin or a question or anything like that, not just me, but somebody much smarter than me, a spectroscopist, is available to you to answer those questions. And that, I think, is a huge part of what we are and who we are. We have all of the bells and whistles that you could ever imagine. We have a vial holder, and we have special sampling accessories for your tablets and for different bottles and things with larger diameters. Can we see through, you know, opaque packaging and things like that? No. It's transparent containers. And again, it allows you to do this work in a very, very robust fashion, because 1064 nanometer based solution allows you to see so many materials in the pharmaceutical realm. It's very fast. It allows you to do this analysis under your own circumstances. Again, if you want to control the analysis parameters and you want to see how it's making decision and you want to tweak that correlation coefficient to your own accord, then that's something that you're allowed to do with a Progeny. And for that matter, I know maybe this might be a little preemptory, but I am currently in the process of sending some information, but also a Progeny to Irving in Brazil. So if you are interested in having a firsthand demonstration on your site and you're still accepting visitors to your site in these times, please set that time up with Irving because he can come into your site and provide you a full demonstration of Progeny. I wanted to thank you very much for coming to join us this evening. I'm going to allow Irving to kind of address any questions that maybe have come up in Portuguese. But before that, I wanted to say, please stay safe and thank you very much for coming, and obrigada.
Muito obrigado, Gil. Muito obrigado, Jen. Muito obrigado a todos que estiveram aí. Tá? Quem já me conhece, né, sabe que nós temos um histórico muito grande aqui no Brasil. São mais de 10 anos de experiência suportando clientes com espectrometria Raman. E estamos aí. Qualquer dúvida que vocês tiverem, qualquer necessidade, eu faço questão de fazer uma visita para vocês. Leve equipamento para apresentar, tiro as dúvidas. Se tiver dúvida de teoria, de qualquer coisa, fica à vontade. Ah, eu tenho dúvida de teoria, eu tenho dúvida de alguma outra coisa. Fica à vontade, gente. Nós estamos aí para ajudar, tá? E mais uma vez, obrigado pela participação de todos. Tenham uma boa noite. Tomem cuidado, né? Cuidem de vocês, de suas famílias, e vai ficar tudo bem.
I agree. Thank you very much, everyone, and please stay safe with your families, and take a look out for a link to this presentation, recorded presentation, and again, reach out if you have any further questions. Thank you so much. Good evening.